Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Baruch College and to the School of Public Affairs. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to our first Vallone lecture for the fall semester of 2010. We have a terrific program this evening, and I know that all of you know the topic in advance, that we're going to be talking about earmarks. Are they kosher for pork barrel spending? We have exceeded our 2 puns per title record for this event this evening. But of course, it's a very substantive and a very important set of discussions about legislative discretion, about how people relate to their elected representatives, about who gets the power to distribute government benefits, and of course about the many organizations that depend on earmarks. On the other hand, of course, we have questions about how those earmarks are distributed, what happens when that funding gets in the stream, how often are those well supervised, and what benefits do we recognize as a people paying taxes and looking at how we actually gain benefit out of the spending that takes place in those cases. We have a very distinguished panel this evening. I can't imagine a better bunch of people to talk about how this works, both from inside the process and outside, from the recipient stream and from the people who are looking at what the quality of that stream actually is. And I will leave it to our moderator this evening to introduce those panelists as we move a little bit later in the program. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our moderator, Peter Vallone, Sr. You all know Peter Vallone. You know him not only from his distinguished moderation of these panels, but from his long career in the City Council, his founding role as council speaker, the author of the Vallone Scholarships, which have made economic and educational opportunity real for so many thousands of City University of New York students. There are very few people who have made as long-standing, as deep, and as profoundly good a mark on this city as Peter Vallone has, certainly on the City University of New York. We are thrilled to be the home to the Peter Vallone Lecture Series, which extends that mark here through thought leadership and through the tremendous programs that he brings together. Peter Vallone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean Birdsell, and thank you very much for coming tonight. We do have a distinguished panel. Perhaps the most distinguished is missing at the moment, but she'll be coming in a few minutes, Councilmember Melita Burrito. But let me just introduce very briefly some of the people that are 3 panelists that are here because they are terrific. First of all, on my far right and your left, no political pun intended, but on my far right, the distinguished president of our Citizen Budget Commission, Carol Killerman, who brings her expertise and experience right from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, where she was a distinguished member, to Citizen Budget Commission, which is, I know very from experience as a former speaker of the City Council, how much we regarded and gave a great deal of respect for whatever the CBC did. In addition to all of the other things that what you see in her biography, she also was responsible for the distribution of $500 million of charitable money that was raised over that September 11th horrible thing that happened in our city. So she has been just tremendous and knows what she's talking about when it comes to things like earmarks and what the various legislatures do. To my immediate left is Nicole Marwell, who's the associate professor right here at CUNY of Public University. She is a doctor with a PhD. She in sociology, and she's an author of books that have to do with what we're talking about tonight. And she is probably one of the most versatile and informed people when it comes to government spending, and charitable organizations and nonprofit groups who depend so much on what we call earmarks, which we'll get to in a minute. And to my far left is a fill-in tonight who's filling in for his brother, Mark Weprin, who we originally asked to be on this panel because he had experience both in the state and the city council. But now we have his very distinguished brother, who I had the pleasure of working with, the chairman of the Finance Committee, David Weprin, who, before he became a councilman, was responsible for several $1 trillion in the Mario Cuomo administration as the deputy superintendent of banks, and as a finance chair for the terms that he served in the city council, was overlooking and responsible for just about everything that happened in the city of New York. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from him too. But let me just set the stage, because there's a lot of confusion between different legislators. The city council is a very unique body because the mayor sets the budget, okay? Now, only the mayor sets the budget. The president, when he sets the budget, or when the governor sets the budget, the legislature, either the Congress or the state legislature, can say, look, stop fooling around. We know there's several $billion more, and we're just going to put it in the budget, and we're going to do what we like with it. And if you don't like it, too bad. And then they can veto it, they can override. But the council can't do that. When the mayor sets a budget, like he did this particular year for $63 billion, all the council could do was plead with the mayor to add money on, or to take money in the budget and redirect it. They could not on their own add money. So that's terribly misunderstood by many, many people. So the negotiation in the city council goes like this. And let me just show you very briefly what happened in this last budget. Of the $63,700,000, there were what they call council additions and spending. And of that $63 billion, $395 million went to restorations. These are not earmarks, these are restorations. What were these restorations? Administration to Children's Services, CUNY, Fire Department, Department for the Aging, Cultural Affairs, Youth Services, Libraries, Health and Mental Hygiene, Legal Services, Domestic Violence, all other programs. Those are the things that the mayor deliberately holds back because he knows the council is going to add them. Unless your mayor was named Mayor Giuliani, who walked out of the budget once, and we just had to work within the budget that was given to us at the time. But these were kind of on consent. So of that was less than half of 1% of the budget. Things that are city-wide. When you're talking about cops, you're talking about fire, you're talking about libraries. These are city-wide restorations. Although they come into the broad generalization of earmarks, obviously they're not what we talk about when an individual legislator gives money. Of the discretionary money that the 51 council members in a council as a unit had to spend, it was only $49.9 million. That's $49.9 million out of a $63 billion budget. That's a fraction of 1% of the entire budget. That's probably what we're going to talk about tonight most, because what are these earmarks? And where did the money go? And how do they do it? And what do they receive in exchange for that? So let's start along that way. And I want to start, first of all, with the chair of our Finance Committee, because nobody knows more about the negotiations that go on into giving each legislator, now he's in the state, but now in the city council, each legislator, how much they have in expense money or capital budget money. There's two different budgets. Expense money is pay salaries. Capital budget is when you build things like bridges and fix roads and things of that nature. So, Mr. Chairman, why don't you give us a brief 5-minute talk about how you've handled earmarks, what is an earmark, and where did they go?
Okay, as the speaker correctly points out, there's a difference between expense money and capital money. And capital money are larger numbers, but they're obviously more complicated, and the money is usually spent over a long period of time. And very often on the capital side, depending on the budget situation, projects are pushed out. So something that might have been done a large number over a year or two could often be over 3 or 4 years or even longer. So it's a little bit harder to so-called follow the money when you initially pass the budget as to how it's actually going to be spent, because it depends on bids for contracts, and it depends on a lot of other factors. But what's commonly referred to as earmarks or member items are basically expense dollars, and they're much smaller numbers overall, as Peter pointed out. 49.3 million of the individual council member items in a $63 billion budget is a very, very small percentage. I think the controversy, if you want to call it that has arisen over certain spending of member items really has to do with transparency and disclosure. And I think the fact that a lot of small groups, little leagues, senior centers, youth programs, if it wasn't for the member item process, and a lot of these member items are very small items, sometimes as small as $3,000 or $5,000, there are much larger member items as well that you often read about. But I personally think as long as you have transparency and disclosure of the member item process, I think it's a good thing.
Can you give us an example of a member item first?
Well, a member item would be could be $5,000 for a local little league, or it could be $100,000 for a large senior center that provides lunches every day for thousands and thousands of people that take advantage of that senior center. It could be any not-for-profit. Basically, you really have to be a not-for-profit to qualify under the process for member items, and you can basically have any not-for-profit, and there is a lot of paperwork involved. So a lot of actually groups don't necessarily, if they're only going to be getting $3,000 or $5,000, sometimes the paperwork that the city makes them go through makes it almost not worth it for them.
On that point, does the money go directly to the council member, or does it go to the group, and how does it get there?
Well, it goes to the group. The council member makes a decision as to how to allocate a certain amount of money, but it has to go to the group. And by the way, the council got criticized a lot for some of the abuses, but there is an agency under the mayoral's control that actually vets every expenditure. It's all done through a particular agency. Most of the council member items went through two agencies: the Department of Youth Services, which are the youth-related member items, or the Department of Aging, which were the senior-related member items, like senior centers or senior Meals on Wheels and senior programs. So
it goes to an agency in government, like if it was a senior citizen center, it would go to the Department of Aging, and then they enter into a contract with the particular senior citizen center.
That is
and they're
correct.
the ones that are supposed to vet it and monitor it.
And it is. It is vetted. It is monitored. There are competitive bids for the provision of these services. In the case of Meals on Wheels, where you provide homebound meals for seniors that do not get out of the house, there are a number of potential contractors that can provide the service, and there is a competitive process within a process.
Thank you. I'll get back to you more. But let's get over to our president on the right here, the President of Citizen Budget Commission, who monitor a lot of these activities. Would you care to comment on whatever he said, or
Sure.
whatever you'd like to add?
Well, obviously, the finance chairman described the process accurately, and it is a relatively small percentage of the budget, although it went down dramatically this year because the council did use whatever discretionary amount it and the mayor felt was available to them, largely to restore cuts that the mayor had made in his budget. And so this $50 million is 20% less than they spent the year before, and I didn't go
I thought
back
that was
and
because
look,
I left.
but it's been closer to $100 million in the past. Nonetheless, it is a small portion of the budget, but that doesn't mean you just say, well, it's a small portion, so you just don't scrutinize it. And as David said, there has been a tremendous amount of abuse. And the council has done probably more than anybody else, certainly more than the state legislature, to police, largely in a reactive way. You know, that's the way we are in New York. There's a scandal about something, then we enact a rule to make sure that you can't have that scandal anymore. And there is a lot of screening of the nonprofits that receive earmarks. And I think I would have said the same thing that David said, which is that with some of these earmarks, you really have to wonder whether it's even cost effective to be giving them for the amount of time and effort that city council staff and mayor's staff spend now looking at them, checking them out, asking to see their tax returns and making sure they're registered. And a lot of these are really very small amounts of money. I think from the point of view of the Citizens Budget Commission, whose job it is to try to assure that taxpayers' money is as wisely and effectively spent as possible, really we shouldn't have earmarks at all, because it's not up to individual members to decide where taxpayers' money goes. It should be through the budget process. We have a budget process. The mayor gives the budget to the council holds hearings, and as the speaker said, everything that the council changes has to be in negotiation with the mayor, but the mayor knows that, and if there are worthwhile nonprofits that are important to the city, then funding them should be part of the programmatic budget of agencies, and the legislative branch should hold oversight hearings and make sure that these things are being done properly. So, in fact, this cannot help, despite the good intentions of everyone, but to serve as kind of a disguised incumbent protection program, because you're making alliances with nonprofits in your district, and they then need you, and they're grateful to you, and they give you credit for having given them the earmark. And it's not that most of these are not very worthwhile organizations, but there are thousands of other worthwhile organizations that don't have a lobbyist, that aren't sophisticated enough to know, that don't have access to their council member, and they are not even in the game of trying to get this very small amount of earmarks. I think another problem with them is, and some people would say this is a benefit, is that because the council has such a limited amount of authority over the budget, the members spend an inordinate amount of time working on these earmarks and trying to get them and trying to get the amount that's available for them to be as large as possible. And perhaps they're not really spending as much time scrutinizing and asking questions and pressuring the mayor on the $63 billion of the rest of the budget, because they're so preoccupied.
On that point, you're making an excellent point in terms of the budget. Don't you agree, however, that 95 to 97% of the budget is all mandated and salaries? What do you expect the council to do about that?
Well, perhaps that's a little probably high. Maybe
so sure.
55% of the budget is personnel, but there are issues about personnel and how they're deployed, and that's what really a discussion about whether to close a firehouse is about. So
that's on oversight. We're
yes.
talking about oversight all year long.
In the budget. I mean, the mayor proposed closing firehouses, and the council restored them. Sure. So, or the mayor yielded to the council restoring them. But these are things that I feel are important to say, and that it's incumbent upon me to say about earmarks, that in an ideal world, there really shouldn't be earmarks. But there are. And they're also an important tool for the speaker to exercise some control and discipline over the members. And I don't think they're going to be going away. And it is true that there are only $50 million in the city. I should say at the state level, there are $200 million. And the budget of the state is not that. It's double the size of the city budget, and it has much more in terms of earmarks. So the city is definitely at a higher level in terms of minimizing them and in terms of the amount of oversight. But there is more that should be done in terms of transparency and making the process more open to those nonprofits that don't really have access to it, as well as to really following up and seeing whether these organizations in fact do something useful with the money. And while David says that they're scrutinized, and the speaker is right that all of this earmark money has to go through an agency, which theoretically is supposed to follow up and make sure that whatever you've promised to do, you do. As a practical matter, they're only a conduit because a member has asked for this money to be distributed, and they get a report and they put it in a file. And no one is really looking to see whether there are metrics for what these grants are given for and how you evaluate whether these nonprofits are really doing the best job at the service they're delivering. And so I think that's an area, the follow-up, as opposed to the pre-screening, which has gotten very, very strict, that we need to do more work on.
Thank you very much. And now let me go right to Dr. Marwell, who wrote a book entitled, let's get this straight here, Book of Bargaining for Brooklyn Community Organizations in the Entrepreneurial City University of Chicago, examines the varying roles of Latin community-based organizations. You've been involved with so many nonprofit organizations. You heard what both our chairman of Finance Committee, former chairman of Finance Committee, and president of the Citizen Budget Committee said. Would you like to comment on that?
I would, yes. I'd like to sort of give a little bit more context on where earmarks fit in government spending more generally. I mean, the bigger question that you want to ask is, what is the purpose of government spending? You might say that the purpose of government spending is to provide services to citizens and to allocate those services where there is the greatest citizen need. To the extent that we currently, and since the 1970s have sort of increasingly done this, we currently contract out the vast majority of our publicly paid for services. And in New York City, that is nowhere, there's no place where we do that more than in New York City. So most of our publicly provided services are done not by city employees at city agencies, but rather by private, not-for-profit, and sometimes for-profit organizations that are under contract to the city. Now, all of these organizations, through the contracting process, the competitive bid process that the Assemblyman mentioned, most of those dollars go through a competitive bid process. The member items, to the extent that there's any competitive bidding, my sense is that it's not very competitive. But again, that's a very small piece of all of these dollars that go out to nonprofits that are providing services paid for by the government. So, the issue that Carol raised is, well, not all nonprofits have access to a lobbyist who can help them connect to their elected official. I'd actually have to disagree with that, because a bigger issue, I think, is that not all nonprofits have access to proposal writers who know how to write a proposal for a complicated government contract and so on. And so the member items, I think, are really a way to actually put a little bit more of a redistributive process into the way we spend our government money. Those dollars reached some of the organizations who don't have the capacity to write sophisticated proposals and get the really big money. Yes, there are some organizations that get fairly large member items, up to $100,000 or $200,000, I think is probably the top. But, given the larger system that we live in, that most of this money is distributed via a contracting process, I think that member items, even though they are $50 to $100 million, it is a very small piece of the budget, and to the extent that we can use our political system as a form of some kind of redistribution, I think that that is actually a worthy goal.
Thank you very much. Council member Melissa Mark Verito, who happens to be one of the most respected new council members that we have in the city of New York, both by her colleagues in the city council and by the administration. She's done a remarkable job in a very short period of time. She's also chairman of the Parks Committee of the City Council and also co-chairman of the Black and Asian Caucus and the Hispanic Caucus, and also co-chair of the new Progressive Caucus. You heard what President Kellerman said from the CBC, Citizens Budget Commission, what Dr. Marwell said. You didn't hear what the former chairman of the Finance Committee said, but everything he said you already know. So comment in any way you'd like.
All right. Well, thank you, Speaker Vallone, and for inviting me to this forum. And I, without apologies, I'm an incredibly strong supporter of member items. And particularly when it comes to communities like the one that I represent, when you talk about Latino, African American, Asian communities, a lot of our very grassroots local organizations, as Nicole was saying, don't have access to the great proposal writers and to spend money in that front. A lot of the organizations that I probably allocate funds to don't have a lobbyist. We have a direct connection as council members to our organizations in our districts. We know them very well. And particularly in communities like the one I represent, they become incredible source of support for the organizations. A lot of them do rely a great extent, and that could be a weakness, on government monies alone. But the reality is, when you look at particularly at Bloomberg, for instance, and this administration, he really believes very strongly in consolidation of resources. And so you start seeing large nonprofits are the ones that are getting a large extent of the contracts or a large extent of the allocations. And that leaves a lot of our grassroots organizations out. It leaves a lot of the smaller Latino, African American, Asian American organizations and grassroots nonprofits out. And so that really is a way of democratizing the process and really getting greater access. So I believe very strongly. Now, I know that the issues, are constantly raised about transparency and accountability. Well, one of the things, and that is all well and good, there have been a lot of improvements, and there's a lot of expectation of organizations now with regards to applying for monies from the city. And that really is a great thing to see. The other thing that we have to also hold ourselves as elected officials accountable is that, we have to model the behavior that we want to see. So since I've been in office, I'm in my 5th year now, but from my first year, we implemented internally a whole application process for our nonprofits. Anybody that requests public money from my office has to put in an application, has to exactly say what they want to use the money for. And then at the end of the year, we expect an evaluation. We ask them to fill out a form to let us know exactly in what way was that money implemented, what programs did you see. And a lot of times we ourselves know, because we're out there and we deal with these organizations day in, day out. We really know what they've applied the money towards. So, there are systems within my office structure that have been implemented as a way of really gaining that accountability and transparency. If anybody were to come to my office and ask what organizations have applied for money, they'd be able to see the applications. We also do put online, after we do make the allocations, who's received money and for what amounts. So, there's also a level of responsibility that we have to kind of model the behavior we want to see. But again, these resources and such a small amount of the budget at the end that is allocated this way, they really are vital to provide important services throughout the district. So I believe that it's very important at the local level, state level, at the federal level, and to the extent that we can seek greater accountability, that's a great thing to ask. But I don't think we should ever give up what we have the ability to parcel out to our local nonprofit.
Madam President.
Who could disagree with what the councilwoman said? I just want to pick up on some of her points. If you accept that there is an important redistributive role that earmarks serve, and there might be some people who don't think that that's should be part of the budgeting process. But if you do accept that, it's really still a question about who's making the decision about where the money is redistributed. And you're to be applauded for having an open application process, but that is something that you took responsibility for. And really, if this is for small nonprofits that don't have a sophisticated way of getting money, then why not have the application available to everyone in New York City and have it online, let everyone apply the same way and fill out the same form so that wherever you are in the city,
Carol, are
the
you
questions
saying
are the same.
You want her to issue her citywide
No,
application?
I'm saying that, and this is going to happen next year anyway, this is something that the Speaker has required, is that there be an online application so that anybody in your district who wants to get an earmark can apply, whether you or your staff know them or not. You may decide not to give it to them. You may make judgments based on your contacts in the community about which ones you think are more worthwhile to invest in, but anyone, including people that the city council member doesn't know, will be able to apply, and others will be able to go back and see which groups received the earmarks and which did not.
But aren't you making it a little bit more harder if you say you have to go online?
Well,
I mean, I'm lucky I do emails now, never mind going online.
It doesn't have to be online. The council member can scan in and then have a complete set of their applications online, even if the group doesn't do it. At this point, with all the rules about checking to see whether you're registered as a charity and listing all your board members and giving them all your financials, you still have to do an awful lot of work. You may not have a sophisticated proposal writer, but you do have to fill out a lot of paperwork now because of the reactive way that we have responded. So there's a scandal with somebody using the earmark for a consultant who's related to a council member. Okay, now you can't do consultants. So we've really added a lot of burdens on to the process anyway, but let it be open so that everyone can see not just who you've given the money to, but who asked and didn't get the money. And then I think you've achieved as much transparency as you can at the front end. And then we need to look at how to monitor what the organizations say they're doing, but that's a separate question.
Let me just take up on that to indicate the ones that applied and didn't. That's like saying, all right, everybody who voted for me, raise your hands, and those who didn't vote for me, would you please raise your hands? I mean, that's kind of silly to expect in the political world that we all live in, to be able to say who applied that didn't get it. I think that, how do you feel about that?
All I know is I haven't found anybody that hasn't voted for me in any of my elections, so.
If I may, as a researcher who looks at government contracts, I'm always wishing that I had the list of organizations that applied and didn't get the money. because it's very illuminating, and there may be a variety of reasons why they don't get the money. Some of them may be political and some of them may be otherwise, but the speaker makes an excellent point. You know, those in control of determining the process understand what that sort of information will allow people to make judgments on, and the political world we live in, as I think you put it, is this really going to happen, do you think?
Yes, it's required next year that all the applications, that there be an online application and that all the applications be online. And
but
not
what
just the ones that you.
I'm not disagreeing with
And I
that,
think
but
that
I think
will
you
help
said,
tremendously.
and then I think you said also publish the ones that didn't. Obviously, we have let's say $1 million to spend, and you have 1,000 applications, and you can the least you can give out is $5,000. I think that's the minimum that you can give out now. Obviously, that better than 2/3 of them are not going to get it, and they'll be listed because the only ones that are, if that's what you mean, I have no problem with that. But if you want to have a separate publication to all the people who didn't get it and say, sorry, I didn't give you the money, I think that's not what you're asking, hopefully.
I am saying that that your decision-making process about how to distribute this money should be open, and that everyone should be allowed to apply, whether you knew them or not.
When you say decision-making process,
And
what do
then
you mean?
there should be a list. Here are the people that received earmarks in my district, and here are the people who applied who didn't get them. And if you have a reason for not giving them, then what is of course you have a reason.
Well,
Everyone should be able to go and see why they did not win the contest, as it were, as well as who did win. And that is ample sunlight. If you're going to have this much discretion given to individual members, then everybody should be able to scrutinize how they went about making the decision. You vote in a public way, and people can see how you vote on legislation and who voted against and who voted for.
Oh, please talk into the mic, because
Okay.
we're being, all right, Mr. Chairman,
Yeah,
former chairman.
yeah. Another area of so-called earmarks I just want to briefly touch on, which really wasn't touched on yet, if it's okay, Mr. Moderator, Speaker Valone.
Absolutely.
We in the council, or formerly in the council, Melissa, in the council, have something called legislative initiatives, and they have it at the state level as well, and they're much larger amounts. And they are, in some ways, kind of a hybrid between the member items and the mayoral or gubernatorial agency contracts. For example, one of the initiatives that I did for at least 5-6 years in a row, maybe longer, when we had some tough budget times and I had to pick one initiative that I thought would make a difference, was an autism initiative, an initiative for after-school programs and summer programs for children on the autistic spectrum. And I used the statistic at the time, 1 in 150, although the national statistics now indicate it's more than like 1 in 100 now, children that are diagnosed with autism. And I did what I thought was a very open process to determine what groups we selected, at least initially. And then we did have an evaluation process working very closely with the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene on how they performed. Obviously, in the beginning, you don't know how they're going to perform until you have a track record. But we tried to do as many providers as possible with the limited allocation of $1.5 million. Obviously, it's larger than a smaller amount. But with that $1.5 million, we tried to provide service in all 5 boroughs. And what I did was I sent out a letter to all my colleagues asking for groups. I sent out a letter to the experts in the field asking for providers, and we used online. And we got a whole database of 50 or 60 or 100 providers in the 5 boroughs. And then we kind of vetted them. And then we had an initial list, and then we had an evaluation process working with the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and they had a scorecard, and some of them either got eliminated the following year or got cut and allocated to other groups that were providing different services. But the idea was basically to make a difference in the community, and a lot of parents came over to me and said it may have been a small amount for an after-school program in their neighborhood, but it really made such a difference with their individual kids because, for the first time, They were involved in basketball and sports and interacting in a way that they felt was appropriate for them to interact. And you could take that initiative and multiply it by every councilman. And the Speaker Quinn, at the time, was very open in allowing all members, and along with me and the finance staff, to basically let members propose initiatives. And obviously, we didn't have enough initiatives for every member to propose multiple initiatives, but we did vet it internally with the finance staff, different proposals of how you could make a difference with a separate allocation from the city council.
Thank you very much, Councilman.
Can I just, one of the things that I really do want to reiterate in this forum is, again, the importance of these items, and I think speaking also to the initiatives, and I'll touch on that a little bit, is, there's obviously structural inequalities that exist in the way that our system functions right now. Certain groups have been disenfranchised, and it's historic in terms of the lack of resources that come to specific communities, the lack of access to those resources when you start looking at, at mayoral administration. So there is an attempt to create some level of equity through the discretion of allocating these member items to groups that have been historically, and communities that have been historically disenfranchised. So this is really, really critical. And you look at also philanthropic dollars to the Latino African American communities are very, very limited. And we have, again, a real structural inequality with regards to private monies that are coming into our communities. So it just keeps compounding a lot of the issues and problems that and the challenges we face in our communities. So our ability, to the fact that we're grassroots, that we're connected to our communities, that we know what the challenges are, this is a way of allowing access to resources to address these historical inequalities. And I think that that's really, really critical, and that has to be understood. So they become very, very vital. The other thing about the initiatives that are also funded from the council, it creates a level of creativity, right? And really looking at problem solving by bringing in new ideas and new energies. And a lot of these initiatives, are very creative in looking at maybe it's health challenges that we have in our city that is not being addressed by the mayoral administration. For instance, we allocated monies for an initiative to basically do sex education or to adult seniors, because the amount of, or the percentages of HIV infection among seniors was on the rise, and it was something that was not being addressed by this administration. So we put an initiative to allocate money to organizations to go into senior centers and to do a level of education and orientation with seniors. When we took a look at the Black Male Initiative through the CUNY system, because of the high concerns that were about the educational achievement of Black men, that's something that we did as a council. A lot of the initiatives that we've created and we've put forth are ones that to some extent then are adopted by the administration because they see the effectiveness. There's a real benefit of allowing that level of creativity and flexibility with the monies that we have available. So any attempt to stymie that, I think, is really just ill-advised. And to the extent we can improve it, definitely I'm all for that. But I would never say that we should give up that opportunity to really allow that level of energy and creativity.
Let me just go into another very controversial area that earmarks have been criticized about. And that's when you give a earmark, is there a quid pro quo? Are you giving that from the standpoint of expecting something back? Now, obviously, that's a crime. If you give somebody, as an elected official or someone in government, you give someone on a condition that they give something back. So there have been council members and legislators who have been convicted of exactly that, of crimes, and some of them went to jail. But by far and large, just to set the stage here, the City Council is recognized as the only legislative body in this country, at least that we know of, that has adopted the most comprehensive campaign financing law in the land. Meaning that if anybody in this audience wanted to give to me or to Melissa or to anyone that's running for office an amount of money, you are limited to the amount of money you can give. And the elected official, the council member, is limited to the amount of money that he or she could spend. So that supposedly took out this whole idea that if I give something, if an elected official gives something to someone and they give it back, they say that's only because he's a member of a particular society or a particular nonprofit group or a boys or girls club or something like that, and you did it only to get that. Well, that I think is an outrageous argument. That's my opinion, anyway. But let's get back to this whole idea of quid pro quo. And let's start off with someone who knows a lot about nonprofits and about getting money for them. Have you heard this argument that there's something, every newspaper will publish that council member X gave something to some organization and got back, somebody from the board of directors gave money for it, and this is clearly wrong. Is that wrong?
It's a complicated question.
Otherwise, I wouldn't ask you.
Yeah.
I mean,
I actually, if I could just speak to, I'm sure people have been reading in the papers over the last few weeks, this very issue going on with State Assemblyman, actually, not a City Council rep, State Assemblyman Vito Lopez and the not-for-profit organization that he founded many years ago, the Ridgewood Bushwick Senior Citizens Council. This group happens to be one of the groups that I write about in my book, so I finally, get a chance to talk about it and have people listen. The quid pro quo, you tend to see around member items, any quid pro quo that does exist, I think, tends not to come in the form of campaign contributions, which is the quid pro quo that lobbyists for corporate interests usually engage in, right? So let's not forget that we see enormous amounts of quid pro quo from for-profit groups and those types of interests. On the nonprofit side, and in the case of Ridgewood Bushwick, what you have is something that looks a lot more like an old-fashioned political machine. I want to really stress that the way in which this is accomplished follows the letter of the law, all right? If you read the stories about Ridgewood Bushwick that are going on right now, first of all, if you read about them in the New York Post, I have to say that the reporting has been absolutely atrocious. I mean, absolutely atrocious.
Daily News is competing, too.
Yeah, very bad reporting in the Post on this. But this is a technically legal thing, so the quid pro quo is not explicit. The way that I think about it is that the elected official is interested in mobilizing a constituency who can support him or her in efforts to pass legislation, among other things, and also direct where the budget goes in member items and in other forms. The not-for-profit, which provides services in the community and is known in the community, and the elected official, who is very savvy, will make it known to the constituents of the nonprofit that he or she has been helpful in providing the types of services that people are able to access in the community. And to the extent that that elected official facilitates contract dollars, including competitive bid and member item dollars, the elected official is playing an important role in the nonprofit's ability to provide services. To the extent that clients of the nonprofit then turn out to vote for the particular elected official, you get this sort of three-way exchange between the elected official guiding money into the nonprofit providing services to the client/voters, and the client/voters then exercising their constitutional right to vote at the ballot box. Now, for me, I actually do not see anything wrong with this, right? To the extent that it is carried out in a legal manner, and again, it is legal to do this, presuming you don't coerce voters into actually voting, what you really have is what democracy is about, the mobilization of a constituency that understands the role of the elected official in directing money into the community to provide resources and services that those citizens can access. And so the question of quid pro quo, this type of arrangement is often portrayed in the press and often portrayed by sort of good government types, if you will, as being nefarious. And it comes back again to this question of what is the resource that poor communities in particular have? One of the major resources they have is the votes of their community members. And so quid pro quo, I guess you could sort of call it that, but in a way that I think is very much in tune with the operation of our democratic system.
So long as they don't go over the line and actually solicit money.
Of course, yeah.
Carol, you are very much involved in this.
Very complicated subject. In terms of
That's
what...
why you're here. You're the best person to answer.
Well, in terms of what Nicole has described, I think it's... yes, it's part of the democratic process. It's part of why it's a tool that elected officials have that is very important to them, and is why we hold so tenaciously on to the earmark. This is why, okay? I would not describe that as quid pro quo. What I would say about it, however, going back to my openness point, is that if a member chooses to give their dollars to an organization that is providing services, senior center, affordable housing, etc., and it becomes a feedback loop in which they are getting support from those people because they're helping them, but the money is not being given to them to help them. It's being given to help the member. It's being given because that organization is delivering a service, and that redounds to the member's benefit that they've chosen so wisely. Then why not let all the other organizations that provide that service apply and let everyone see which one that member has chosen? There's no reason not to do that. And if it becomes apparent to people that there's a feedback loop there, so be it. There is nothing wrong with it. Okay, that's not what I would consider a conflict of interest. I think that the City Council has adopted some very detailed conflict of interest rules about member items. And they are really focused entirely on whether somehow the member item actually is of financial benefit to the member, that it pays the salary of someone on his staff or of a relative, or that
which is clearly wrong.
Which is clearly wrong, and the council has adopted a number of rules. But, you get into the question of how distant the relative, what's an association, and what I find missing from the rules is that that's all they're about. And that if you work in the nonprofit world, you know that everything isn't about money. If your spouse is on the board of a nonprofit, it doesn't really matter whether he or she gets paid through the member item. They're on the board. They care particularly about that organization. They have probably a responsibility to help raise money for that organization. And so if their spouse gives that organization a member item, the conflict is not necessarily because that board member gets paid. That's very unlikely to happen, and of course would be wrong. But there's a whole other level of support and assistance to the spouse as a board member of the organization that's not financial. And that's really not addressed by the rules. The rules say, for example, the more money your spouse or your associate makes at the organization, the more relevant the contact is. Not necessarily. You may be helping an organization, and that organization has your son as an intern who makes no money. But it's a relationship that you start to develop with that organization. And the point again is, what about the other senior citizen organizations? What about the other little leagues that don't have that kind of an association, that aren't really getting a chance to get into the process? And if that's what the purpose is to allow openness, then let everyone have a chance to participate and let the public see how the members made these decisions.
Let me just also point out that a quid pro quo is a term of art, and it's a crime under the law. So that was why I mentioned it, that this is a very gray area when you're trying to do something legitimate, and in turn somebody gives you back money, and that's not the reason why you gave the thing in the first place. But on priorities, I forgot to mention that there are different priorities in every borough. We have 5 boroughs, all of which could be states all by themselves and are larger than most of the states in the country. So, for instance, when it comes to negotiation on what you might call an earmark or restoration, Queens County desperately needs, and Staten Island desperately needs, tree cutting, because you have trees all over the place. Manhattan could care less about trees, and that's not a priority for Manhattan. A priority for Manhattan might be restoration of the street signs, many of which are missing, Department of Transportation, that kind of thing. Priority for the Bronx would be, give me some priorities, borough-wide priorities from the Bronx.
Well, I'm majority Manhattan, so
I think you're on that caucus over there. But
10% of my district.
a priority for the Bronx always was jobs, creating more jobs because of the necessity to get people back to work. So they would put money into the economic development portion of it. And each borough had different needs. Yeah. So when you would be publishing, why does Queens give money to trees and did not give it money to libraries? Well, it's obvious, because they needed the problem, and some of the other boroughs couldn't care less about the serious problem that you have in Queens. You saw in Central Park where someone got killed strictly from failure of maintenance on a tree. And you're chairman of Parks Committee, so that's...
I've learned a lot about tree pruning and the
Yeah.
priorities. You're right, in Manhattan, we don't understand it to the extent that it is a need, but now,
Right.
very...
And the only other thing I want to close with, if anybody wants to make a comment about it before we open it up to questions. You raised an excellent point, Madam President, on the end of Citizens Budget Commission, on about why should the council pick out these things? Isn't there a better way of doing it? Why not let the mayor do it? I mean, the mayor is obviously nonpartisan, and he or she would know. Well, don't have the mayor do it. Let's have the Citizen Budget Commission, or let's have the League of Wonderful People pick out the thing. Of course, they are certainly non-political, and they would not favor anybody. The whole world is built on relationships and trust and credibility. No one knows better what's going on in their district than the person elected from that district, particularly the council member who is closest to the people. And is in session all year long, never out of session. With pardonable pride, the legislature, they're lucky. You don't want them in session, but they're only in session half the year. And they're removed entirely from the problems of the district because they're up in Albany working, and you're not going to go complain to them about the fact that that there's a terrible smell from the treatment plant, which happens all over the place, wherever you have a treatment situation. And certainly not the Congress members or the senators. They're busy for international relations. So all the complaints go to the council member and the council member's office. And I don't know who knows better what is needed in the district than the council member. Now, that's different from a quid pro quo, where fortunately over the years, there's only been 2 to 3 council members that have gone past that line and have paid the penalty for it. But in many other places, it's a lot more than that. And you're reading the papers now, what's happening on a statewide level and what's happening on a federal level. A controller of a state, who was a former assembly member, has now paid the price. So people are confusing a crime from what goes on in normal life. It's what you have a budget in your own home. You can't spend all the money on one thing. You have to divide it up. And you don't go around telling all the people who didn't get the money why you're not giving them the money. You know better who needs the money in your household. You know better that you need it for food, or you need it for car fare, or you know it for this, you know it for that. And you're not going to go around telling people who didn't get the money why you didn't give it. And government has responsibility, because government is public. We're talking about public money, not private money. I agree wholeheartedly with the president that, fine, publish it all. But in terms of notifying the people that you didn't do, as to why you didn't do it, I strongly disagree, because it just cries against everything that a person does in public office. You don't want to go out there and tell people that I didn't fund you, because actually you're not doing a good job in what you're doing, or actually I don't think that you're doing what you said you're going to do. You know best what Little League works in your community. You know best what doesn't work, or they would like to work, or they would like to get government funding. And I don't know who else knows better. Certainly not the mayor or the administration. You know, they're there to enter into contracts that people who know what they're doing give them to do. And you have a responsibility to do the best that you can.
I just wanted to kind of close, and it's kind of a little cynical comment, but it doesn't just apply to member items, it applies to other things. And I agree full-heartedly with Speaker Vallone that the council members are the closest in the community. I know, because I used to be one, now I'm an assembly member, and everybody thinks you're in Albany all the time, so you really don't have to be bothered as much.
But you still get earmarks.
We do. Although this year it's kind of in doubt. We haven't resolved that.
That's right.
But I just want to leave you with a quote from a former political figure, a former judicial figure who has passed away a number of years ago. But it's really kind of a famous quote, and it kind of tells you something, although it may be a little cynical. Former Brooklyn surrogate Bernie Bloom, many of you may know, former long-term Democratic district leader, was often criticized when he became surrogate for appointing people that he knew to appointments, for judicial appointments, guardianships and conservatorships and other things where lawyers actually made money, and he used to appoint lawyers that he knew, that he dealt with, that were his former associates. And he was criticized for that. And his famous quote was, well, who do you want me to appoint, my enemies? And there is something to be said to that, because it's not so much, enemies or supporters, but it has to do with the people that you know and you trust and that you know will do a good job.
So let me end on that note, because I think we really have a great panel here. Madam President, thank you so much. Carol Kellerman, Councilmember Martha Garrido, you're terrific. Dr. Mike Marwood, you're fabulous. And former Chairman of Conference Table. Thank you all very, very much. Watch it on CUNY TV. It'll be back on several times as we go.